already? Well, yeah, it's tremendous to see such a super turnout. Throughout Scottish history, I think there's perhaps one subject more than any other that has engendered a great deal of emotion, a great deal of legend, certainly a great deal of song, and that piece of history we're going to look at tonight. It has, of course, a great deal of local connection, being in the middle of all that was happening. History couldn't just miss out Strathspey. Our subject tonight is the Jacobites, in story and in song. We have, to tell us about that, someone who is very expert in the subject, who is also expert at passing on the subject to other people, perhaps not normally of our age group, slightly younger people. He hides behind his lectern. I noticed one or two of them here. But we have, not in story, not in song, but in person, Alistair Mackenzie on the Jacobites.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Mr. Sadler. There's a very bright light coming in here on the from my right-hand side here, and plenty of other bright lights, and I think within about 5 minutes I'm going to go leaking. So if you don't mind, I'm going to pick off the formal suit for a second. And you all, I trust, know that tonight's chat is about the Jacobites. In story and song, as Strathspey and Maidmark Herald assured me. So I thought we'd begin with a song. And I have to excuse the throat a bit. It's taken a bit of a pounding this week. It's been a hard week in the school, and Wednesday night tawdry, so you can understand it's been a fair week all told. Anyway, this is a song that was based on some old verses. Some say it's an unclaimed production by Robert Burns. Whether it is or not, we're not terribly sure. In any case, it certainly sums up the topic for tonight. It's called Ye Jacobites by Name. Ye Jacobites by name, lend an ear, lend an ear. Ye Jacobites by name, lend an ear. Ye Jacobites by name, your faults I will proclaim, and your doctrines I unblame. Ye shall hear, your doctrines I unblame, ye shall hear. What is right and what is wrong, by the law, by the law. What is right and what is wrong, by the law. What is right and what is wrong, the short sword or long, how weak or more strong, for they draw, how weak or more strong, for they draw. What makes heroic strife, famed afar, famed afar? What makes heroic strife, famed afar? What makes heroic strife, take when the assassin's knife, or hunt a parent's life in bloody war, or hunt a parent's life in bloody war. Then let your schemes alone in the state, then let your schemes alone in the state. Then let your schemes alone adore the rising sun, and leave a man undone to his fate, and leave a man undone to his fate. Ye Jacobites by name, lend an ear, lend an ear. Ye Jacobites by name, lend an ear. Ye Jacobites by name, your faults I will proclaim, and your doctrines I unblame, ye shall hear. So, the Jacobites then, the introduction. I recall on one particular occasion setting an exam paper for secondary 2 pupils. And I posed the question, a Jacobite is one of 3 things. A Scotsman. B, an Englishman. C, a supporter of James II. And surprisingly, or not surprisingly, I got 3 answers. Ticked. Now some did it out of knowledge, some did it out of desperation, but in fact, on reflection, I realised that my question was badly worded, and that it really is all 3, because you could have an English Jacobite, contrary perhaps to popular belief. You could have an English Jacobite. You could have certainly a Scottish Jacobite, and indeed, a supporter of James II was a Jacobite. So who were the Jacobites? Who are the Jacobites, for that matter, or their ancestors? Was a Jacobite of 1690, say, the same as a Jacobite of 1745 or later? Well, I'll try to answer some of these questions as we go along this evening. But first of all, in good Max Bygrave's tradition, I want to tell you a story. And it begins in April 17th, 1719, and again, tonight, I really don't know how much prior knowledge is available, probably more expert in many ways than I am, but I'll assume that you haven't heard this little story. And it starts on April 17th, 1719, when 4 Irishmen, there's a Captain Wogan, a Captain Misset, it's a good name for an Irishman, I suppose, Captain O'Toole and a Major Gaydon, they rode out of the town of Strasbourg on the banks of the Rhine, heading east. Now, it wasn't at all unusual to find Irish mercenaries, Scots mercenaries for that matter, in the 17th and 18th century, in European countries fighting. But these 4 Irishmen had a fairly romantic mission to undertake. They were set to, their destination was Innsbruck in Austria, and their objective was to rescue a Polish princess. Now they took with them a young servant girl called Jenny, because the idea was to use the classic switch routine. They would enter the castle, remove the Polish princess, and leave Jenny in her place. Unfortunately, Jenny was about 6 inches taller than the princess, so she had to wear flat-heeled shoes and get built-up shoes for the princess. In any event, they managed to secure the princess and left Innsbruck, or left the castle in Innsbruck in a bit of a hurry. Like most women, of course, the princess had left a parcel of jewels back in, and poor old Captain Wogan had to go back and get it from a local inn. Apparently it was dead at night, he had to remove an open door by the hinges to get back in, but nevertheless he succeeded, and the journey was continued. They got to safety in Italy, and the story might have ended there. But what's all this got to do with Jacobites? Well, the girl being held was Clementina Maria Sobieska, who was the granddaughter of the famous King John Sobieski of Poland. And she was being held against her will in the castle of Innsbruck to avoid her marriage, or to prevent her marriage rather, to James II of England and VII of Scotland, who had, since his father's death in 1701, been recognised by his supporters as the true King of Britain. And you'll have noticed you've got a piece of paper that I did, again, when you're producing this. Again, it's possibly old hat, but nevertheless, it does give us a clear indication of why the Jacobites claimed, rightfully, if you believe in hereditary succession to the throne, that later on Charles the Young Pretender was the rightful king. James I and VI of Scotland, Jamie the Sax, had gone down to London in 1603 to claim the inheritance of his mother, Mary Queen of Scots. Charles I, Charles II, the son of, and then the brother James II. And the figure 1, of course, in brackets, the equal sign means married, the 1, his first wife Anne Hyde, the daughters Mary and Anne, Mary having married William of Holland, and Anne, whom we'll return to later. And the second marriage, Mary of Modena, and it was the product of that union who was James the Old Pretender. He married, eventually, this young princess, Clementina Maria Sobieska of Poland. The significance of this, of course, was going to become much greater later on, especially on the product of the second marriage. The first marriage, Anne, daughter of James, no problems. But when the second marriage produces a son, then we have the problems. Well, to understand the full significance of this marriage, we must go back into the 17th century. And when I looked at the topic under discussion tonight and thought, well, where will I begin? It is very difficult to know where exactly to start. But I thought I'd choose as a starting point the Civil War in England
which had started in 1642 and was at first fairly evenly contested between the Royalists, the Cavaliers, and Parliament, because after all, it was an argument between King and Parliament over the purse strings, which was, of course, the curse of the Stuarts, always hard. It's a common complaint, but this was their particular curse. And as I say, in the first year of the war, it was pretty even. There wasn't much to come and go on. But by 1643, both sides were certainly looking for some help from the Scots. And although some Scots, for example, the Marquis of Montrose, were loyal to King Charles, the great majority were prepared, at Parliament's request, when they asked for aid, they were prepared in Scotland to help. But they insisted on one important condition of this aid, and that was that the Presbyterian faith, the Presbyterius, the Greek word for elder, the Presbyterian Church, which had been created at the Reformation in Scotland, should be established in England, which is a strange demand in many ways, because if you consider that the Scots had been stubbornly refusing to have Catholicism or Episcopalianism forced upon them by successive monarchs, yet they fully expected the English to accept Presbyterianism. Nevertheless, 1643, the Solemn League and Covenant was signed, and the Scots agreed to send 20,000 men to help Parliament in return for this Presbyterianism in England. Now, this religious division then marks the real start of the story, of which Jacobitism was a later manifestation. The period 1643 to 1660, which is choose 1660 fairly accurately because it's the year that General Monk marched an English army out of Scotland, was one where Presbyterianism held sway. However, in the same year, Charles II was restored the monarchy, and with him, a revival in the Episcopal Church. And one of his early acts was the Recissory Act of 1661, which in fact repealed all the acts of the Scottish Parliament since 1643. Now that almost certainly was a blow to most people in Scotland at that stage, because after all, the Presbyterianism and parliamentarianism, but these ones are getting longer in a minute, held sway for so long, it was difficult for them to accept the Recissory Act. And nearly one-third, of course this went bishops back into the church. Nearly one-third of Scotland's ministers at that stage resigned or were expelled because they refused to accept the new laws or the rule by the bishops. Well, it didn't stop their religion. They continued to preach in conventicles in the hills, the areas of Lanarkshire, which I happen to know quite well from when I lived in that area. I remember visiting a baptismal font in the hills, near Lead Hills, the village that was almost cut off from the rest of the known world earlier on this year. And way in the hills there was a large stone with two large grooves in it, which in fact was a baptismal font used by the Covenanters in the conventicles in the hills above, beside Lead Hills, the Lanarkshire Ayrshire area. Strong Covenanting country. Heavy penalties, of course, were exacted against the Covenanters, who openly rebelled in 1666, only to be brutally suppressed by Thomas Hamilton of DL. Then there was a period called the Blink, which has only lasted just over a year, where there was a period of comparative calm. But elements, the more extreme elements among the Covenanters, decided that there could be no compromise at this stage. And the rebellion of 1679 saw further atrocities by both sides committed in the name of religion. When Charles II died in 1685 and was succeeded by his Catholic brother James VII of Scotland, the second of England, the persecution continued. The Cameronians, who had been founded by a gentleman called Richard Cameron, I recall, issued what they called the Sanker Declaration, disowning the Catholic James as a murderer and idolater. The Earl of Argyll returned from exile in Holland to raise a rebellion in favour of the Duke of Monmouth, who was an illegitimate son of Charles, and Protestant, which of course made him acceptable. But this scheme was nipped in the bud by imprisoning leading Campbells and sending more dangerous Covenanters to the Bass Rock or to Dunnottar Castle near Stonehaven in Kincardineshire, where they had the most horrific punishments exacted upon them. If they tried to escape, for example, lit matches were stuck between the fingers, and the conditions they were actually held in, appalling, feet of mud in the dungeons at Dunnottar. Argyll himself was beheaded Although the story is that he showed such courage and sang-froid that an hour before his death he had a good sleep, so he could be well prepared for it. This killing time and this period of fearful slaughter continued unabated, with Covenanters being sent, as one leading politician at the time rather mockingly called it, they were being sent to glorify God in the grass market of Edinburgh. However, it's possible, I think, despite all these difficulties, that James himself may have been accepted, because the heir to the throne was his daughter Mary, who was a Protestant, married to William of Orange. Unfortunately, as I said earlier, in 1688, June 1688, his wife Mary of Modena gave birth to the boy, who was to be James, the Old Pretender. And someday he would become king, instead of the half-sister Mary, 23 years his elder. Leading Whigs at the time, and I'll come back to this, was the Whig and Tory a bit later on, leading Whigs at the time contacted William of Orange, William of Holland, and said, would you be prepared to come and to take the throne? Purely on the religious ground, but also the ulterior motive was, of course, to accept parliamentary rule, which is something, of course, the Stuarts would not, under any circumstances, accept. Charles I had lost his head over the heads of that same problem. The divine right of kingship, the right to rule, passed on from generation to generation. And that was part and parcel of the Stuart philosophy. The Whig tradition for parliamentary democracy, or as was the development of parliamentary democracy, was much stronger. In the event, King William arrived in Torbay, Devon, and about 20,000 men, and made his march to London, and support was forthcoming from all quarters. I think James at that point realised that he wasn't going to have the popular support, certainly in the south. He knew them could very well be supported in the Highlands of Scotland, partly because the Catholic religion held sway in the Highlands of Scotland. And there lay his best chance of success, or in Ireland for that matter. That's why eventually he went there. But in any event, Parliament met and literally forced his abdication, just agreed that he should abdicate. And the crown was offered to William and Mary. The new monarch accepted Parliament's condition in the Bill of Rights, and the so-called Glorious Revolution, 1690, had been achieved. But of course, not everyone accepted that revolution, and the supporters of James, or Jacobites, from the Latin Jacobus, meaning James, tried several times to alter what had happened in 1689, 1690. The first of these rebellions came in the same year as the Glorious Revolution, led by possibly one of the most famous of the early Jacobites, John William of Claverhouse, Viscount Dundee. And he's the subject of the next offering. Bonnie Dundee, words by Sir Walter Scott, and the heir, and he made this comment, in fact, in his journal in the 22nd of December, I've put it down here, 1825. He said, the air of Bonnie Dundee running in my head today, I wrote a few verses of it before dinner, taking the keynote from the story of Claverhouse leaving the Scottish Convention of Estates, or Scottish Parliament, in 1688. He was the first man, in fact, to transfer the name of the city of Dundee to Viscount Claverhouse, Viscount Dundee, Bonnie Dundee. And of course, Scott himself, well known in his early years for his Jacobite sympathies, and this was his famous ditty. Little heirs of convention, 'twas Claverhouse who spoke, ere the king's crown shall fall, there are crowns to be broke. Then each cavalier at love's honour and me, let him follow up bonnets, oh Bonnie Dundee. Come fill up my cup, come fill up my can, come saddle my horses and call up your men. Come hook the westport and let us get free, for it's up with up bonnets, oh Bonnie Dundee. Dundee is mounted, he rides up the street, the bells are backward, the drums they are beat. The provost douceman said, oh, let him be, the good tunes will renew the table Dundee. Come fill up my cup, come fill up my pan, saddle my horses and call up my men, unhook the westport and let us get free, for it's up with our bonnets, oh Bonnie Dundee. pictured waves the grass market was found, as if half of the west had set tryst to be hand. There was spite in each look, there was fear in each heed, as they watched for the bonnets of bonny Dundee. Come Philip, my God, come Philip, my hand, saddle my horses and call up my men, and book the westport and let us get free. For it's a way of bonnets of bonny Dundee. There are hills beyond Pentland and lands beyond Forth. If there's lairds in the lowlands, there's chiefs in the north. There are wild Dunny vassals, 3,000 times 3 will cry whoop for the bonnets of bonny Dundee. Come Philip, my God, come Philip, my man, saddle my horses and call up my men, and both the westport and let us get free. For it's a way of bonnets of bonny Dundee. So Dundee then, the Viking, he left his home, his lands, Dudhope, outside Dundee, and he raised the Royalist standard and headed for Loch Harbour. He realised there that there was a government army heading towards him, led by General Hugh Mackay of Scourie and Sadler, who had been fought in the Low Countries and was now leading a force of Dutch and Scots troops. And they met at Killiecrankie. And of course, we're all aware where Killiecrankie is, but you know, as you go through the A9 there and you see the steep-sided ravines, I don't think the battle was quite where the route of the A9 is, but it can't be far away. In any event, the Highlanders used their well-kent and their well-tried method of attack, taking the high ground, allowing your opponent to get into the valley, and then with a wild Highland surge, destroy them. Mackay's men were totally unable to withstand the charge of the Jacobites at Killiecrankie. They had in fact been issued with a new plug bayonet, which apparently took some fitting onto the muzzle of the muskets, and not a bayonet that day was stained with Jacobite blood. Unfortunately, as the story is well known, Dundee, 25 years of age, Claverhouse, was killed at the battle. And with his death, I think, went any hope at that stage, in any event, of the Jacobite success. The song Killiecrankie, well-worn song Killiecrankie, written by Robert Burns. Some of the words have been added over the years, and over the last 10 years, there have been various folk songs and folk artists have added to it. But this is something of the words of Killiecrankie. Where heaven say brawler, oh where heaven say brandeo, oh where heaven say brawler, come ye by Killiecrankie, oh, and ye giving for I you would nothing say continue, and ye hae seen what I hae seen on the praise of Killiecrankie, I fought at land, I fought at sea, at home I even fought my auntie, but I met with the devil and Dundee on the praise of Killiecrankie. The boat that God fell in the far, and Claver's God sick a clanky, or I had fed and a full gled on the praise of Killiecrankie. Oh, fine Mackay, that God you lie, and the moon is all the Grankie. You'd better kiss King Willie's loof, then come ye by Killiecrankie, and ye for I hae been. You would have been sick and and ye hae seen what I hae seen on the braes of Killiecrankie. Killiecrankie. An interesting version, I think, of Killiecrankie. Clay was getting a clanky, and I had fed an apple gled, a hawk. The carrion after the battle, of course, as in those days was quite common to us, in there picking at the dead bodies, which is a super subject. The remains of the Jacobites, having won at Killiecrankie, bedraggled though, losing their leader. The leadership was taken over by a gentleman, an Irish successor to Crankie, Colonel Cannon, who unfortunately was defeated by the Cameronians at Dunkeld. And the remnants of that army, and his successor, travelled to Speyside, to the Hawks at Cromdale. And it was there that Sir Thomas Livingston, with the aid of, as Mr. Sadler was pointing out before we started, of the Grant family, I think. And if you can give me that amount of...
Captain Grant of Elfies with 600 men. 600
men, which was unusual, as you point out, for a commoner to raise troops at that stage. Now it's interesting that the historical fact that a Grant helped the government army, because the words of the song, The Horse of Cromdale, do not represent much in the way of historical truth. I'll sing the song, and we can come back to the words in a second. Oh, was I coming by afternoon, I was just a wee bit frae the tune. Tae the feelings I was bound to view the Hawks o' Cromdale. I met a man in tartan trews and speered at him what was the news. Would he the Highland Army ruse the day they come to Cromdale? We were in bed, sir, everyone, when the English hosts upon us come. Bloody battle there began upon the Hawks at Cromdale. The English horse, they were sae rude, they bathed their hooves in human blood. But our brave lads, the bravely stood upon the Hawks of Cromdale. But alas, we could no longer stay, and o'er the hills we far away. Sir, we did lament the day that ere we come to Cromdale. Thus the great Montrose did say, Hielandman, show me the way. I will over the hill this day to view the Hawks of Cromdale. The MacDonalds, they returned again, the Camerons did their standard chime. Macintosh made a bloody gain upon the Hawk at Cromdale. The Grant, Mackenzie and Mackay, when Montrose they did espy, oh, they fought Muskelly and lay upon the Hawk of Cromdale. Of 20,000 Cromwell's men, 1,000 fled to Aberdeen, the rest of them lie on the plain, lie on the Hawks of Cromdale. Now the mention of MacDonalds, Camerons, Grahams, Macleans, Macintosh, Mackenzies, and Grant. Now indeed Grant fought at the Hawks at Cromdale, but on the government side. I have heard that they could see the massing Jacobite troops on the Hawks from the castle, and forded the Spey somewhere down between here and Cromdale, or beyond Cromdale, I don't know. But the truth and the song seem to be some variance. Whether it's two songs or two stories, myth and legend, all combining, the copy that I got was an original copy by A. Stewart, bookseller, Grant and Spey, and I think it's an old copy, priced 1 penny, so it's a very old copy. So, well, whether the truth, where the truth comes or where the truth lies. For example, Montrose, I mean, I will over the hills this day, said Montrose. He would have been a remarkable fellow because he was beheaded in 1650, or hanged rather, and dismembered in 1650. So it would have been very difficult for poor old Montrose to go over the hill that day in 1690. Nevertheless, it was the end for the Jacobites at Cromdale and Speyside. The other, of course, event of great significance, or perhaps not great significance in terms of historical significance, but in terms of Highland folklore, the massacre of Glencoe, 1691 into 92, probably as famous an event. I mean, even those south of the border have heard of the massacre of the MacDonalds. When the 30 MacDonalds killed by, on the orders of Sir John Dalrymple of Stale, carried out by Campbell and Lyon, after accepting the hospitality of the MacDonalds, committed an act of treachery, barbarism, and parliament, really, I suppose. All the 30 people massacred. It's, you know, where does a massacre start and finish? Nevertheless, the idea of hospitality being rejected is more than human flesh could bear. There are songs, modern songs, written about Glencoe. I think the interesting thing about Glencoe, the massacre, is that it kept Jacobitism alive in the Highlands. At a time when things weren't going too well, to say the least, it did keep it alive. And Glencoe was not forgotten, and it helped to keep the Jacobite cause alive into the 18th century. Now, a lot of what I say, I've had of necessity remove bits and pieces here and there, but I'm going to jump a bit now into the 18th century and look for a moment at the Union of 1707. And the reign, which of course that takes place in, is the reign of Queen Anne, 1702. And although she was not particularly in herself a very interesting person, interesting events certainly happened during this 12-year reign. Politically, Queen Anne represented a sort of pause in the dynastic or monarchic conflict. The Act of Settlement, which had secured her succession, was accepted by most people, even Jacobites, as James, their candidate, was 23 years younger than his half-sister. As a person, she's been accused of inconsistency, vulgarity, and totally devoid of royal charm, one historian has put it. But at least she has some characteristics, which is more than can be said for her husband, who has been described as, he was a brother, I think it was Christian V, the King of Denmark. And he was an agreeable blank, somebody once called him. And I think Charles II's description takes as good or makes as good an attempt at description as I've got. He said, Charles II, I have tried him sober and I have tried him drunk, but there's nothing in the man. So that sums up George. Their marriage was, to say the least, fruitful, but none of her 17 children survived infancy. The events of the greatest significance, of course, took place around 1707 with the combining of the Scottish and the English parliaments. Now this, of course, in itself could occupy the next hour and a half, possibly, speaking about the union of the parliaments. But I mean, no apology for skipping over what is obviously a major change in British constitutional history. And we don't have too many examples of sudden, dramatic constitutional change. I think certainly the Union of 1707, of I would say the Parliament Act of 1911 as well, when the power of the House of Lords was still curtailed for the second last time, I would say. Certainly there are dramatic changes, and the British Constitution being an unwritten sort of constitution tends to evolve rather than see dramatic changes. And this was a dramatic change, but as far as we're concerned tonight, there was no longer a Scottish Parliament. Then, when all sung, said, well, lamented Lord Seafield, who was in fact Scotland's last Lord Chancellor. The Scottish regalia, so ceremoniously produced at the rising of the Parliament, magnificent ceremony of the old Parliament in Edinburgh, now disappeared. They did emerge in 1818 at an exhibition arranged by Sir Walter Scott. And when planning the ceremony, Scott recalled the union and its significance in a letter to the Duke of Buccleuch, where he wrote, and I quote, among the rebel company which debauched my youth, there was a drunken old Tory who used to sing a ballad about that same regalia at the time of the Union, in which they were all described in the most basic way and basest way. In fact, he spoke of the crown, for example. He said it was to make a can for Brandy Nan, of course Queen Anne, to blank in when she's tipsy, and modesty prevents me from saying what the blank stands for. And further on he says, but I think that's a fairly good idea. Further on it says, farewell thou ancient kingdom, who sold thyself for English pelf, money, riches. Was ever such a thing done? So the restoration of the ancient kingdom and the return of the Stuart line are now seen by Scottish Jacobites, in any case, as part and parcel of the same operation. Of course, there were opinions to the contrary, and I quote from here a Scottish minister of the time, August 1714, he wrote, this month makes a vast change by the Queen's death. and the peaceable proclamation of King George. The joy so great and universal that they've seen nothing like it since the Revolution, when I was but young. This is a wonderful dash to the Jacobites, and had the Queen lived a little longer, they think their schemes would have taken effect. However, the Lord hath broken the snare, and we are escaped. So that was obvious. He was fair, hardly Jacobite in sympathy. But there were Jacobite sympathisers, of course. And here's the words of a popular song, in both Scotland and England. Old H, which is obviously meant to be Hanover, doth turnips sell, and through the streets does cry them. Young Noodle leads about the ass to such as please to buy them. Such folks as these can never be compared to Royal Jimmy, who is our true and lawful king. I hope ere long he'll see me. It was a favourite joke, incidentally, at that time, to pretend that since turnips had been introduced into England by Lord Townshend, Turnip Townshend as it was referred to, that was accepted that the royal family ate nothing but turnips at every meal, and this was a Jacobite statement. However, the Hanoverian succession took place. Now, at this point, I mentioned earlier the Whigs and the Tories, and I'd like to just have a look at this. If we try to define the Whigs and the Tories at this point, the Tories basically were landowning, conservative, with a small c, Anglican and traditional in their respect for the crown and their belief in hereditary succession to the throne. And they supported, of course, James. The Whigs were merchants, manufacturers, mainly dissenters, nonconformists, violently, sometimes anti-Roman Catholic, and believed in the supremacy of Parliament, because their revolution, the Whig revolution of 1689-90, had put, or the Whig supremacy, had been the cornerstone of their policy. And they didn't care for the idea of divine right of kingship, the idea that the Stuarts were supreme. So what was the results of this succession, and the Hanoverian succession? Well, first of all, from a wider point of view, George I's total devotion to Hanover led to British involvement in European affairs for the next 100 years. The fact that he spoke no English, nor did his son, as the Scots referred to him as the wee German lady, George II, led them to choose ministers from one particular faction. Now, I use the word faction rather than party because we can't really see 18th century politics in terms of 20th century politics. There weren't parties as such, there were no party lines and party whips and that sort of thing. It was factions. You voted for perhaps personal gain. There was graft and corruption. And you voted on a vague line. But there were genuine, general sort of lines, for example, the ones I mentioned earlier. But he did tend to select his ministers from one party. And of course that party was going to be the Whig party. Because now Tory equaled Jacobite. Now, in fact, it's not necessarily the case. Many were Anglican rather than Catholic. But there were some very large and powerful Roman Catholic families in England who were Tory. But the majority, high Anglican. So this is a significant point, in that the king did choose from one party. And thus began the Whig supremacy, which was to be at its height with the reign of Sir Robert, well, the rule of Sir Robert Walpole from 1721 to 1742 as Prime Minister, the first Prime Minister. And the very job Prime Minister, of course, was Walpole's, because he chaired the cabinet meetings, because the king either in Hanover or couldn't speak English, and then all the responsibility fell on one man. And the cabinet system and the Prime Minister's job, or the First Lord of the Treasury, as the official title grew up. Now, the Hanoverian succession didn't please all Scots. The Darien scheme of the 17th century, where the Scots attempted to found a colony in the Isthmus of Darien in Panama, ended disastrously. Perhaps we took the wrong items to barter with and to speak to the natives. We took wigs, Bibles and snuff boxes, which I don't suppose the natives of Darien were too keen to get their hands on. But at the end of the bottom line there says that King William didn't help the Scots colony. And there was bitterness and resentment. But the union of the parliaments passed on. But it wasn't popular with all the people of Scotland. There were dissatisfaction. And of course, the Tories, very dissatisfied with this. Because of course, they realised that Tory equaled Jacobite. And as long as that was the case, there was no chance of their regaining political power. So to choose the candidate, James II, or James III, sorry, James III of Britain would have been, and James the 7th, the fact, for the 8th, that would have been to their political advantage. So, 1714, the Queen died, Queen Anne died. And it wasn't 100% certain who would in fact succeed. But as it turned out, George I, and again referring to a succession table, we see that in fact he has a claim, a strong claim, through his mother, Sophia, the daughter of Elizabeth, who was the sister of Charles I. So on the female line, George I had a very strong claim. But of course, the male hereditary succession comes through to James, the Little Pretender, rightful king. But George and pudding time came over, and moderate men looked big sir, Joseph Addison. In any event, he becomes King George I. And the Jacobites decide it's a good time to have another rebellion, another attempt. This one is led by the Earl of Mar. Well, it was partly led by the Earl of Mar. Bobbing John, as he's referred to, because his sympathies from time to time could be questioned, and he perhaps bobbed backwards and forwards between the sides. There were many Jacobites, so-called Jacobites. I think Lord Lovett, Simon Fraser had various times in his career had dual loyalty. But Bobbing John, Earl of Mar, raised his standard for King James at the Braes of Mar in Aberdeenshire on the pretence of a hunting party, and was going to wrest the crown from the Hanoverians. It's interesting that point in passing here, his name, Bobbing John, they seem to go in for names like that in those days. The other one I love to quote is Jingling Geordie, and Jingling Geordie was George Heriot of school fame in Edinburgh, and Jingling Geordie seemed to jingle the coins of the treasury more often in his own pocket than in the treasury. Jingling Geordie, there's still a pub in Edinburgh, I think, that I would know, but there's still a pub in Edinburgh called Jingling Geordie's. Anyhow, the 15 Rebellion, a disaster from the start. It's, again, a point of interest here about Mar's involvement. There's an extract here, River calls September the 9th, 1715, Jock. He was in the right not to come with 100 men he sent up tonight, and he expected 4 times the number. It's a pretty thing when all the Highlands of Scotland are now rising up on their king and country's account, that my men should be only refractory. I have used gentle means, and so I shall be forced to put other orders I have in execution, particularly that my own tenants in Kilbrummy know that if they come not forth with their best arms, that I will send a party immediately to burn what they shall miss taking. All this is not only as you will be answerable to me, but to your king and country, your assured friend and servant, Mar. A letter from Earl of Mar to John Forbes, his bailey at Kilbrummy. So he was letting his clansmen know in no uncertain terms that he expected total loyalty in this venture. But everybody seemed to know about this venture. I'm afraid the network of government spies are very active. Everybody seemed to know about the venture. I don't want to go into the detail of the 15 rebellion to too great an extent, but I think it's important to know that there were several rebellions in various parts of the country going on at the one time, but they were badly organised. There was little coordination, and Mar committed the mistake of splitting his resources. One example of the bad planning, I think, was in their attempt to take Edinburgh Castle when they went into a hostelry in the Royal Mile and drank to the King's success, and probably the success of temperance, before they attempted to take the castle and were duly arrested. The noise they were making presumably scaling the walls. The whole thing was rather a fiasco. James himself wasn't anywhere to be seen. He wasn't over from France yet. He was to land in Peterhead. And there is a story that he passed through Aberdeen, and there's an interesting point. I was looking at some old books last time I was in the town, and I came across one about the Green, which is one of the oldest parts of Aberdeen, behind Union Street. And there's a public house, it seems to be a well-known public house, the Old King's Highway, it's called. Now, in the older books, it mentions a Skipper Scott's tavern in the Green, and it does mention a personage dining in Skipper Scott's on Finnan Haddies. Now, it could very well be that that personage, this royal personage, was King James on the way south, for he went south through Fetteresso and eventually took ship again at the end of the rebellion for France again, through Montrose. The one major battle of the rebellion was at Sheriff Muir, outside Stirling. And it's unusual in terms of battles, in that it was a draw. But a draw was no use to the Jacobites. They had to defeat the government forces and take Scotland, wrest the power from the government troops. And a popular poem at the time sums up the Battle of Sheriff-Muir. Some say that we won, and some say that they won, and some say that Nain won at Taman. But one thing I'm sure, at Sheriff-Muir, a battle was there which I saw. And we ran and they ran, and they ran and we ran, and we ran and they ran a war man. And that's exactly what happened, because the right wing of the government army, I think it was, routed the left wing of the Jacobite army, and vice versa. So both sides thought they'd won the battle. They were come toing and froing. It was a draw. It certainly was indecisive. Argyll, who led the government forces, Duke of Argyll, who led the forces, is reputed to have said during the battle, when he saw the right wing of his army rout the Jacobite left, spare the blue bonnets, which wasn't the thing the government wanted to hear at all, and in fact he was relieved of his command soon afterwards. But a draw it was, no use as far as the Jacobites were concerned. Now the results of this, several chiefs, leading Jacobites, executed. In fact, when they went to London for punishment, they weren't to be just hanged, they were to get the full 18th century treatment, the drawing, the disembowelment, the whole works. In fact, the two lords in question, Lords Derwentwater and Lord Kenmure, were reprieved from that horrific treatment on account of their status. But they did go to the gallows. Kenmure, the Right Honourable William George, Viscount Kenmure, became the subject of one of Burns's poems, of Kenmure's on in a war, Willie. And in one line there is, success to Kenmure's band, Willie, success to Kenmure's band. There's no a hurt that fears a whig that rides by Kenmure's hand. So the exile, the hangings, the executions continued. And James arrived, a wet blanket of a man, I mean a colourless sort of character who eventually arrives at St. Peterhead. And the significance of that little episode, in fact, arriving in Peterhead, meant that one of his supporters, George Keith, the Earl Marshal, was exiled because he landed at Peterhead, which was part of his territory. And he was to return with the Marquis of Tullibardine, who was later to be one of the 7 men of Moidart in the 45 rebellion, in 1719. And there was another attempt in 1719, when there was hopefully to be a huge Spanish army, a sort of modern, an 18th century equivalent of the Armada, was supposed to come, for 30,000 people. But only 300 arrived, and it was only the Earl of Seaforth, on the island of Lewis, with the Mackenzies, who showed any willingness. We surely weren't sheep stealing on that occasion. They were showing willingness. Well, they met the government force led by General Whiteman in Glenshiel, in a rugged pass still known as the Spaniards Pass, and I'm assured by my Gaelic advisor, Donald John MacLeod, there, that should read Bialach nim Spantiach, which means the pass of the Spaniards Pass. I'm sure that's all wrong, but never mind. Anyway, they were defeated, and the 1719 rebellion failed. If there had been any chance of success, I would have thought 1715 was as good a chance, because you still had the remnants of the 17th century attitude. By the time 1745 comes along, I think we got to the stage that people didn't believe in lost causes by the middle of the 18th century. I'll say later on, it was the age of reason. You had men like Samuel Johnson. You'd had the age of Addison and Steele, and moderate men did look big, sir. And that's that wee bit late. But nevertheless, the young pretender, born on the last day of December 1720, a handsome youth, was going to have this one final attempt to put his father back on his rightful throne. A child of high intelligence, there seems little doubt of that. He spoke English, French, and Italian fluently. We don't know how much Gaelic he spoke, but he had a tutor, a man called Alexander MacDonald, or Gaelic MacDonald as he was referred to, who became a sort of Jacobite poet laureate. But he must have spoken some Gaelic. In fact, he must have soon realised that the form of his name, Charlie, which became popular, was simply the Gaelic Charlie, which the T-E pronounced TCH in Gaelic. And it's not an English diminutive, so Charlie isn't an English diminutive really, it's from what his honest Highland men had said, chair, and it sounded more like Charlie. To the Anglified ear, it was Charlie. Now, the attempt, as I say, in 1745, there's so much could be said about the 45 rebellion. I mean, it's a subject in its own, but I think it's worthwhile looking at Obviously, I look at the 45, I try and say something of the song and something of the background to it. But again, I think the French or the foreign help was the major contributing factor to its downfall. There's countless occasions in history where small nations or small forces require the help of a larger nation to achieve whatever political end they require. I think I was speaking today to a class at school about Italian unification in the 19th century and the attempt of the Piedmontese, which were the Sardinians, the northern area of Italy, to overthrow the dominant Austrians, and they couldn't do so without an outside agency, and that agency could only be France or Britain. Well, Britain being a maritime sea power, no use, so they looked to France, and they got the French to help them to drive the Austrians out of Italy, and so unify the country. And again, we depended very much on continental help to drive what the Jacobites considered were the usurpers now. But French help, force of circumstance, strict of fate, denied against. The ships scattered by a storm, and Charles and the 7 men of Moida, a motley complexion, several Irish, Englishmen, Francis Strickland, and E.S. MacDonald, and the Marquis of Tullybarden, Duke William, and the 7 men of Moida, a very inauspicious start. And the Mackenzies this time, I suppose, said, well, we got our fingers burnt the last time, so once bitten, twice shy, sort of thing. So they weren't too keen, they were a bit slow in coming forward. And the vital moment, of course, was when Cameron of Lochiel decided to throw in his lot with the Jacobites, and it's quite interesting to look at Cameron's comments on the matter. Charles Edward said, "In a few days, with a few friends that I have, I will erect the royal standard and proclaim to the people of Britain that Charles Stuart has come over to claim the crown of his ancestors, to win it or to perish in the attempt. Lochiel, who my father has often told me was our firmest friend, may stay at home and learn from the newspapers the fate of his prince." "No," said Lochiel, "I'll share the fate of my prince, and so shall every man over whom nature or fortune have given me any power." Indeed, Lochiel came with his Highlanders to Glenfinnan and the march to restore James, the old pretender, the prétendant, the claimant of the throne, on his throne in London. Wade, who of course had built the roads after the 1715 rebellion to open up and to civilise the Highlands, Charles Edward found them very handy as he came through Corryarrick, down what is now the line of the A9, down Dolphinny, I suppose, through Drumocta when it was open. The gates had been closed that day, and he reached his perch. There were several skirmishes. There was the camper at Coltbridge, for example, when several dragoons scattered by a handful of Jacobites. Apparently, one of the dragoons fell into a pothole, and the clatter he made was so great that 30 Jacobites were close behind them, and they scattered at such a speed that the horse never ate corn again, and so Jacobite folklore has it. And Edinburgh was arrived. Now, Edinburgh itself was, by this time, Whiggish. There's no question of that. They weren't desperately keen to allow the Highlanders in. They heard that General Sir John Cope's transports were off Leith, and they stalled for a few days to try to allow Cope's men to arrive there. As it turned out, Cope's men weren't going to much use anyway, but the Highlanders charged through the gate at the west port, the nether port perhaps it was, and Charles Edward entered Edinburgh in triumph. Although triumph as far as the ladies were concerned, the ladies were each at the windows, straining their voices with joy, but the men remained sullenly in the far corners of the rooms. I think there was a certain touch of jealousy, but the handsome young prince had arrived. I suppose it would be the same if Lady Diana appeared, the women would be on one side of the room, the men would be on the other. I don't know, perhaps. In any event, Edinburgh was taken. Cope arrives. Now, the Battle of Gladsmuir, as it's called, or Preston Pans, as its more popular name, gives us I think, one of the finest of the Jacobite songs. There's been a lot of versions. Burns wrote a version, several other versions. The ones I've got here are by a man called Adam Skirving, who I've been unable to find anything out about at all. But Johnny Cope, its significance later on, of course, was that it was going to be used as the reveille for the Scottish regiments, as part of, I think, of the rehabilitation of the Highlands, and when William Pitt the Elder in the late 1750s restored, the Tartan was restored, and he used the ferocity of the Highland Charge and channeled the ferocity of the Highland Charge into the British Army. So the revaling of the Scottish regiments, Johnny Cope. Sent a challenge for Egan bar, saying, Charlie, meet me on ye dar. I'll show ye the earth to war if you'll meet me in the morning. Hey, Johnny Cope, are you walking yet, or are your drums a beating yet? Can ye well walk, and I would wait to come to the coals in the morning. When Charlie looked the letter up on, he drew his sword the scabbard from. Come follow me, my merry man, and I'll meet Johnny Cope in the morning. Now Johnny B, is did your work, come let us try with fire and sword, and dinner flee like a fretted bird that chased me his nest in the morning. Hey, Johnny Cope, are you walking yet, or are your drums a beating yet? Can ye well walk, and I would wait to come to the coals in the morning. When Johnny Cope he heard of this, he thought it wouldn't be amiss to hae a horse in readiness to flee a war in the morning. When Johnny Cope the barrack came, they speared at him, "Where's all your men? The deal confound me, and dinna ken, for I left them all in the morning." Hey, Johnny Cope, are you walking yet, or are your drums a beating yet? Can ye well walk, and I would wait to come to the coals of the morning. The battle itself was really a triumph for the Prince's Commander-in-Chief, Lord George Murray. A much maligned character in the 45 Rebellion, Murray. The Prince was never 100% sure of his loyalty, which was most unkind to Murray. Indeed, he was a loyal servant to the Prince. But Murray was an astute general, and he realised that the position of the government troops before Preston Barnes was pretty good. Cope had chosen an excellent position with the sea behind him and a marsh and the wall of a large house in this side. Murray had to get that army turned from this very, very strong position. He did so with the help of a local shepherd, a local guide, called Robert Anderson. And they crossed a marsh which was very, very impenetrable, a difficult area. He got his men through early in the morning, hence the words in the song. And as the mist rose, that sea hard, of course, crawls up the first port, and any of the East Coast ports for that matter. They came in a field of stubble, the corn had been freshly cut, and the Highland troops, the Jacobites, in the early morning, coming on a pace, working up to this wild charge across the stubble, like a train, I suppose, I think, although they hadn't been invented yet. The running of the feet, the momentum being picked up all the while. And as the mist cleared, about a mile apart, a few hundred yards apart, the two armies were shown to each other. They were fairly untrained and fairly raw recruits, Cope's men, and they scattered before the Highland charge. I think the significance of this battle for the Prince was that he believed, I think now, that his men couldn't be beaten, couldn't be defeated. But he should have perhaps realised that the men he did fight at Preston Pans were rather untrained. The bulk of the English army, or the Hanoverians, to call it an English army, the Hanoverian or government army, was fighting on the continent at this point. They were battle-hardened, toughened troops, but Cope's men were a bit inexperienced. Nevertheless, the capital was secure, Scotland was secure, and it's at that point, of course, that the Jacobites, who were mainly crofters, had to go home. You know, we've done our best, we must go home. And many deserted, many joined, many deserted. Not for any evil reason, they just said, we've got to go home now, we've done our bit. The Crusaders, the early Crusaders in the earlier years, when they took Jerusalem from the infidel Turk, and then found, well, what do we do with it? Now we have it. We've got to go home, and they all went home again, and the Turks flooded back into Jerusalem again. Once you have it, you've got to defend it. The delay in Edinburgh, the 6 weeks, parties, the carousing in Edinburgh, very pleasant time, I would have thought, for the Prince and his followers, but it was perhaps a delay he could ill afford. The march south. The English Jacobites were far too few in number. He expected many, many people to flock to his cause. But I think the prosperity that the Union had brought, the lack of conviction for a cause that was really a 17th century cause, wasn't there. 500, I think, joined them from Manchester, for example, through Macclesfield. on to Derby. And the retreat from Derby, disastrous. The Prince knew that his hopes were fading when he retreated. There was no other course of action. Although London was in panic, I mean, there's no doubt about this. I think if we remember I think it's the fourth verse of the national anthem says, like a torrent rush, rebellious Scots to crush, God save the King. It's very seldom sung. It was written at this particular point in London. There was a real fear of the Jacobite invasion. Banks, running the banks. They were taking money out of the bank at the back, they were putting it in the front, they were dishing out the money to the depositors in sixpences to make it take longer to do it. Very serious threat to the economy. The king, I think, took horse to Brighton, if I remember rightly, with his art treasures. There was real panic. I don't think the Jacobites realised that. Days of communication, of course, slow. They didn't, in fact, know what was going on in London. So the retreat. The prince, stubborn to the last, stayed in his bed. He was always up first, apparently, in the march south, full of high spirits. After Derby, he was always last up, dragging the heels of it. And it was this stubborn attitude which had been seen in him as a young boy, in fact, which was to prevail, to make him a bit difficult to live with after the retreat. An army in retreat is never, it's a bit like when you play rugby. If you kick a ball and you're a lumbering forward, as I used to be, you kick the ball up on a muddy day, it's great as long as you're going forward. But when some rotten fullback kicks it all the way back down the park and you've got to turn the thick glower and get back to your own 25-yard line, the legs, the spirit may be strong, but the flesh is definitely weak. And it's an unrewarding task, ploughing your way back. And I think the Jacobites, they're footsore and weary is an understatement. Glasgow, they returned to Glasgow. Lochiel saved the city. They were for putting the city to the torch. Lochiel saved them. I believe they still ring the bells on Lochiel's birthday. There is a pipe tune about Lochiel's welcome to Glasgow. They come north, back the V9, retrace the steps, and find themselves in Inverness. The night march to Nairn, a disaster. I think the attempt that he made to reconstruct the conditions which had been so good and so useful to the Jacobites at Preston Pans, this was an attempt by Charles. It was the advice of O'Sullivan, his Irish advisor, much against Murray's exhortations. He decided to take O'Sullivan's advice and attack Cumberland's camp at Nairn on the night before the Battle of Culloden. Cumberland had come back by sea from the Europe and had travelled north to Aberdeen. In fact, Cumberland House is where he stayed in Aberdeen. It sits behind the townhouse in Aberdeen, diminutive beside the glass monstrosity. But the citizens, of course, the good citizens of Aberdeen, of course, welcomed the gates, and a few thousand government troops was good for business. So they're very quiggish in Aberdeen, of course. They like the idea of money. Still do, I suppose. In any case, the night camp at Nairn, Charles had the map, not that, Inverness to Nairn, it's not a huge distance, but the terrain then was rough, boggy, marshy. They got there. But a drum was heard in Cumberland's camp. The redcoats, I suppose, were astir. The order was given to retreat. So a tired and weary band of Jacobites arrived back in Inverness, April 1746. The battle itself, most of them were too tired to think of anything but sleep. But Charles tried vainly to rally his troops in the morning of the battle and had exhausted them to great. I swear this sword will cut off so many heads today and will want for nothing afterwards. But I think it was whistling in the dark. I think the Prince himself knew by this thing the cause was lost. And the Jacobite army, most people, I don't know if you, apologies to those who've heard this, but this is the famous story of the Highlander in the Corriaric Pass when the Redcoat army approached and the lieutenant saw this massive Highlander on the hill and he said, take 2 men up and arrest that hairy Highlander. And they went up, they never came back. And the fellow appears in the hill again waving his claymore and take 10 men up the fellow's head. I want it. They never came back either. He says, take 50 men up there, that fellow must be taken. And eventually one cut and bleeding private arrives back and says, it was an ambush, there was 2 of them. Now, the idea of a massive hairy Highlander is not, in fact, doesn't go with historical fact. The average height, now, I don't know who calculated this, but some historian must have bothered to get the information. I'm sure it's beyond me, but the average height with it was about 5'4". So it was small. Perhaps the average height was brought down by the fact that there were many herd boys and older men in the Jacobite ranks that sleety morning on Drumossie Moor, as it was referred to more often than Culloden Moor, Drumossie Moor. The battle itself, a disaster. O'Sullivan, good Irish tradition, had chosen possibly the worst battlefield he could have chosen. If he had set Britain high and low, you couldn't have found a worse battlefield. Constricted by two dikes, the Leanach enclosure and the Culloden enclosure. The front line, as I say, the Highlanders depended on their wild surge. The front line, because of this constriction of the two walls, was going to be askew at the vital point of contact with the enemy. The artillery that the Prince had was of different calibers. They got the wrong caliber of shot to the wrong cannon, whereas the Cumberland's men had plenty of field pieces of artillery loaded with grape shot, which of course, I think Lord Elco at one point, that was one of the Duke's men said, the grape shot galls them terribly. Great gaps were cut in the Highland ranks. Fearful weapon, the grape shot. In fact, Cumberland's artillery was winning the battle without, in fact, a charge, and the Jacobites were being held back. The order to charge wasn't coming. And when it did come, as it came, there was a surge of one wing forward too soon, and the whole line got out of straight. And by the time they were repelled, they were on the way back as the right wing went through, and the whole thing degenerated into a complete disaster. Cumberland's men, of course, had been given this new bayonet drill, which also was to prove decisive. They landed actually and practiced it in Aberdeen, in the builds in Aberdeen. The idea of not taking the man directly in front of you, but taking the fellow to his left with his target, his shield in one arm, and his sword arm raised, that you would aim for that gap between targe and sword, between the ribs there. And that was going to be, and it takes discipline. But this was the difference between Gladsmuir, Preston Pans, and Culloden. They were tough, hardy soldiers. And not, of course, again, contrary to public belief, general popular belief, all Englishmen. There were several, the Royal Scots. There were the Scots Royals, for instance. It's quite a confusing point. Many people get this confused. There were the Scots Royals fighting with the Jacobite army, and there were the Royal Scots fighting, of course, with the government army. There were people of all different occupations. There was a chap, Bradshaw, fighting with the Jacobites. He was a chapman, a street bearer from Manchester. There was a gentleman from Leith, I think it's William Leith from Aberdeen. He was a snuff grinder. There was a chap, Smith, from Angus. There was a noble, a tinker, who was a friend of this wig maker from Angus. All sorts of people within the Jacobite ranks, equally. But the bulk of the regular government army was made up of people who'd been, some of them had been at Glasgow, some remembered the poor billets on the way north. They were fresh, someone said, fresh in their resentment. The habit of the enemy was strange, their tongue even stranger. And the treatment of the defeated Jacobites after Culloden, appalling. The story of Kingston's light horse as they walked down the Edinburgh Road and killed a man and his son ploughing in a nearby field, nothing to do with it, but order. General Wolfe, who was later to win fame and glory at the heights of Abraham in Canada with the British Army, refused a superior officer order, in fact, Cumberland's direct order, to bayonet anything living on the battlefield. He refused. Insubordination, he could have ruined his career. But he was a man of compassion, he refused to do it. Several the stories could fill. There's the story of the prisoners, in fact, after Culloden, I think, is worth the quoting. And there were several 18 officers shot at Culloden House, 30 men found in a barn near the battlefield, then tightly fastened, set on fire, not one of them escaping. No one knows how many wounded men were murdered in this way, but it's been calculated at least 180 men were found, taken back to the battlefield and shot there. The Prince probably lost between 1,000 and 1,200 in the battle, and there are records of 3,471 prisoners, and this is the account of the conditions on one of the prison ships. I went on board the vessel called the Pamela, and on my looking down into the hold where the prisoners then were, I was saluted with such an intolerable smell that it was like to overcome me, though I was provided with proper herbs and my nostrils stuffed therewith. The prisoners were called up one by one, such as were able to come. The number of those who came on deck were 54, many of whom were very ill, as appeared by their countenance, and their snail-creep pace in ascending the ladder, being only just able to crawl up. To hear the description given by the guard who went into the hold of the uncleanliness of that place is surpassing imagination and too nauseous to describe. And they were fed from the refuse of the street, lights, cows' lights, and just the sweepings of the vegetable market. Threw them into flux, as another writer at the time says. It was over. And with the defeat at Culloden really ended the Jacobite cause. Now, up to now I've mentioned songs and poems and all the rest of it, but of course after Culloden, most of the songs of Culloden, of course, were not the sort of song that I've been trying to sing tonight. They were laments, and most of the laments for Culloden were obviously in Gaelic. Most of them written by a gentleman called John Roy Stewart. And my Gaelic advisor again, Dr. MacLeod there, assures me that this gentleman comes from Kincardine and Badenoch, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Kincardine and Badenoch is between the boat and Culloden Bridge. So indeed there's a connection, a local connection with the Jacobites. But John Roy Stewart wrote several laments. He wrote 2 laments on Culloden, one of which begins, and here I'm going to get my phonetic Gaelic to play. I can see Dr. MacLeod giving me a steely glance here now. Over more mochuish flech. Now I don't know if that sounds anything like what it should, but it means great is the cause of my sorrow. Probably great is the cause of their sorrow, but never tried to teach me Gaelic. And he goes on to speak of Cumberland's brutality and mourns the fate of the handsome red-haired Charlie and the dead clansmen. And I don't even think I'll attempt this one. Well. Mochrach harmelch numbriaken fi ersculises te pasca hatch. So there. It means, woe is me for the host of tartan, scattered and spread everywhere. But they are the true Jacobite songs, in that sense. But Jacobitism has come to be known and come to be almost the feeling of being Scottish in that sense. But I suppose at the time, the real laments, and there must have been hundreds of laments, in every clan, hundreds of men, either killed or exiled, the lament being played for the dead and the fallen. Prince Charles Edward's romantic wanderings, of course, has filled several books since The Prince and the Heather, The Flight of the Heron, all dealing with Charlie's remarkable stay in the Scottish Highlands, pursued but never betrayed, even with £30,000 on his head. He did put a £30,000 reward, of course, on George II's head. He started with £30 and actually upped to 30,000. Didn't want to appear the Jacobites, they appeared cheapskates. But the romantic songs that have been written since, and this one by Robert Louis Stevenson, another great Jacobite sympathiser, some of his great books, Kidnapped, Katrina, and the rest. This one, of course, is well known. Sing me a song of a lad that is gone, stay with that lad behind. Merry old soul, he sailed on a day over the sea to sky. Mull was a stem, rum to the port, egg on the starboard bow. Glory of youth glowed in his soul, where is that glory now? Speak me a song of a land that is gone, say could that lad behind. Merry old soul, he sailed on a day over the sea blue sky. Billow and breeze, islands and seas, mountains of rain and sun. All that was gone, all that was fair, all that was me is gone. Sing me a song of a land that is gone, say could that lad behind. Merry old soul, he sailed on a day over the sea to then the Stuart cause was dead at the end of the Battle of Culloden. Finally laid to rest by the successive Acts of Parliament in the late 1740s, the Heritable Jurisdictions Act, for example, which took the power of the clan chiefs from them, took the power of gallows and pit away. It had failed due to the late start of the rebellion, the failure of the French to arrive, lack of Lowland and English support, plus, as I said earlier, the growing prosperity since the Union. The 18th century also, as I said, was the age of reason. Divine right of kingship and religious persecution seemed incongruous to the writers of the 18th century. And the influence of these men letters in the South was soon to be felt in the changes brought about from vengeance lang as ta'en a nap, but we may see him walking. Get help today when royal heads are hunted like a market hare. Awa Whigs awa, Whigs awa, you're but a pack of traitor loons, you'll day nae good at all. Or perhaps the verses of Lady Nairn, Caroline Oliphant, born 1766, I think it was, born in the Owl House, Gask in Perthshire. She was third daughter of a Jacobite laird, and later married her second cousin, Major Nairn, later Lord Nairn, who succeeded to that title, in fact, by attainder, which meant that his elder brothers had been tainted by the Jacobites, in that sense. And she was to write 87 songs, many watered-down versions of rather indelicate verses, but she's well known for many of her songs. I think The Land of the Leal, Calla Hearn, The Laird of Cockpain, or Cockpain, and The Owl Hoose, which incidentally, I mentioned this to someone the other day. I said, when you hear some Scots singing The Owl Hoose, you tend to think of, I always tend to think of a small cottage, a thatched house in the Heelands, I suppose, with the roses round the door and the kale yard and the midden. But in fact, it was the Owl House was, in fact, the grand house of Gask in Perthshire, Lady Nairn's father's house, and it was a rather large and imposing mansion. But I never had to say think of the Owl House in that way. But perhaps her most sentimental song, and perhaps the song of the exile, I remember once going to see a second cousin of my mother's off at the station once in Aberdeen. Nobody really liked him very much, but we sang Will He No Come Back Again, or Bonnie Charlie's New War, and there wasn't a dry eye on the platform. Maybe it was because they liked him or something, you know, he never came back anyway. Bonnie Charlie's New War, safely o'er the friendly men, only a heart will rock in war. Should he ne'er come back again? Will he no come back again? Will he no come back again? Better would ye anarchy. Will he no come back again? Ye trusted in your feeling men, they trusted you, dear Charlie. They kent you hiding in the glen, death and exile braving. Will he no come back again? Will he no come back again? Better would ye anarchy. Will he no come back again? Sweet the labour's note and long, lilting wildly up the glen, but aye to me he sings a song. Will he no come back again? Will he no come back again? Will he no come back again? Better would ye anarchy. Will he no come back again? I'd like to just conclude here by saying that this romantic ideal has been overdone perhaps in many ways. You get Jacobite cruises, for example, I think in the main, it's down from the old boots in Inverness, and you get Jacobite lounges, and Jacobite this and Jacobite that. It's got nothing to do with the original meaning of the word Jacobus, and the Latin James, the old pretender. But one writer, I'm sure he must have been an Englishman, when he said that the Highlands were remorselessly and finally conquered. I'm sure many people would take great exception to. And as the years passed, they became a barren wasteland, which I'm sure others would take great exception to. But Charles Edward had been their one moment of hope. And as despair deepened, and despair certainly did deepen, he became a heroic, almost legendary figure, comparable to King Arthur. For in myths, defeated nations can find consolation. Islam has lingered on Jacobitism. The Jacobites, for that matter, have lingered through the years in sentimental song and verse. Perhaps the old Jacobite of old, the Clansmen, the Mackenzies, the MacDonalds, the Camerons, the Stuarts of Appin, were more interested in their own domain, their own clan area. I'm sure it was the case, that it was parochial. They were interested in their own bit of land. And they didn't have any real desire to influence the course of national history. But the 15 and the 45 especially, even in the last decade, have produced songs, I would say, worth the singing. And here's one that's been written in the last 10 years, I suppose, which I think, it's a rousing tune. It's a tune that probably sums up much of what I feel about it, and what maybe a lot of Scots feel. It's called The Rose of Lischerry. Come now, gather now, dear, where the flowers grow. White is the blossom as the snow on the bend. Here now, freedom's gone, we'll mark a solemn vow. Now by the roses of Lischerry, fight again at Bannockburn, your battle axe to wield. Fight away your grandsires in Flodden's bloody field. Fight at Culloden, your bonny princely shield. Fight by the roses of Lischerry. Come now, gather now, here where the flowers grow. White is the blossom as the snow on the bend. Here now, freedom's gone, we'll mark a solemn vow. Now by the roses of Lischerry, Tuckerston, frae the green fields of Banket, Beat and Cole. Ships frae the Clyde and the nation in the hold. The water of life some men need to make them bold. Black golden fishes frae the sea now. Come now, gather now, here where the flowers grow. White is the blossom as the snow on the bend. Here now, freedom's call, we'll mark a solemn vow. Now by the roses of Lischerry. Thank you very much.
I wonder, very briefly before we finish this evening, whether there's anyone in particular wants to make any points on the local side of this. We've had such a full picture on the Cromdale involvement. It certainly seems that was more or less the last Grant part in the episode. They didn't seem to be involved at Culloden. As I gather it, they were owed something like £76,000 in damages, and they said, until we get this, we're not turning out to the government for a wee while to come. And that seems.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's my unexpected pleasure to thank Mr. Alistair Mackenzie tonight. I already know how lucky the children are in school to have him as a history teacher, because my own daughter had him, and I know how much she enjoyed history. And I think we must all admire his talent for taking the bones of this romantic story which appeals to us all and clothing it with the human interest that we all want to hear and making it come alive for us. And the meticulous preparation which is behind his easy unfolding of the story is obvious. All the work which he must have put into it. And we all appreciate that, I'm sure. And that's all without the songs. The songs which highlighted it all and which we've all enjoyed so much. I really think that such a sort of succinct, lively, interesting talk has been appreciated by us all. And I'd like to thank Mr. Mackenzie for myself and for us all for such a lovely evening.
Thanks to everyone for coming. I'm sure you've all found it worthwhile. I might just mention we have a collection to cover our expenses. Notice of our next meeting is on the door. That too should be well worthwhile. And there are some photographs about of last summer's great events, which some of you might be interested in. It might be a bit difficult for people to see them, but there is an album just at the door. Thank you very much indeed.